Vladimir Putin and Russia came out with their terms for ending the conflict. And this was from NBC News. Putin's demands to Ukraine underscore a position the West always suspected: no compromise. The memorandum was less of a peace plan and more of a demand for Ukraine to surrender, defang its military, and become a vassal of Moscow. Now, at the same time, you have people like Lindsay Graham who very explicitly comment on this matter. Here is what he had to say during his surprise visit to Kiev just days before the Istanbul talks and all of these attacks.
President Trump said that Ukraine doesn't have good cards. Well, Russia's much bigger and has a lot more people. I get that. But the world has a lot of cards against Russia. And one of those cards that we have is about to be played in the United States Senate. In America, you have more than one person at the card table. We have three branches of government, and the House and the Senate are poised to act. What would change our mind if Russia came to the table, agreed to a ceasefire?
Well, when I see Lindsey Graham, I want to throw up, generally speaking. And he's from my home state. I'm going to back every penny I have left in my bank account behind the woman who's running against him, because she is really something. As my father said, Lindsey Graham is a jerk, and I'm not giving him another penny. He's a lying sack of all right before he died. That was on his deathbed. He really fell out with Lindsey. And he lived right down the street from him in Cross Creek Plantation, at least one of Lindsey's houses at that time. But he's a jerk. And I don't take anything he says for gospel, except I take it for his pronouncements on the empire. An empire, by the way, Lindsey probably hadn't looked at the bond market lately, but an empire that is rapidly going down the tubes. If you look at the bond, the Japanese just said, sorry, don't want any more, certainly don't want any more 30 years, and probably don't want any more 2-year bonds. And American citizens are saying that now, too. So we're headed for a tremendous fall. And Lindsey's expostulation there, as it was conceived in his mind, that we are so big and so powerful and that we have lots of levers we can pull and just bring Moscow to its knees, is absolutely ludicrous. And Lindsey's going to find that out over the next 18 to 24 months. I feel sorry, and I didn't say I think I'd ever say that, for the Senate of the United States when they have to deal with what's coming. That said, I don't think Russia is falling off of a single parameter that we've known for some time now. And I don't think they're about to fall off a single parameter, because they have, through blood and treasure, won. That's the way wars work. Check your Clausewitz. That's the way they work. One side wins and another side loses, or you have a draw and a bigger power comes in. There are all kinds of permutations. But in this case, one side has won and the other side has lost. Now, because this isn't really a war between Ukraine and Moscow, and it's really a war between the United States of America and its vassal states in Europe, who are rapidly becoming non-vassal, and Russia, it's a different dimension. So the fact that Donald Trump has to participate in this is a prime requisite, because the war is really between him, despite his denials thereof, and Putin, or Russia and the United States, with NATO as an appendage and Ukraine as the really bloodied proxy. This will go on forever because we want it to, and Russia isn't going to give up. I don't care how long we talk or how many cities we talk in. That's the reality of this situation. And it's going to be very difficult to change that reality unless someone says uncle. And I don't see Donald Trump saying uncle. He's the art of the deal man. And he's got to come out of anything that happens that he participates in, even if it's mainly at the top, if you will, geostrategic, geopolitical top, US, Russia, and better relations. Those are soured so badly now that I'm not even sure they can be achieved. But even if they were achievable and that were what he concentrated on, the bottom's going to eat his lunch. So I'm not sanguine about this at all.
Well, one of the big problems with this administration is fundamental problem. It's not just with this administration. It's, I would say, for the previous administration as well. I almost appreciate the Obama administration on as big of a critic as I was about so many of the new wars that were started and so forth. There was at least some logical, you could follow some line of thought, but you can't hear. The problem is you see, because if all of your ideas and your beliefs and assumptions about the parties that you're dealing with in the international system, like Russia, for instance, okay, if they're all based on erroneous talking points that are on heavy rotation on Fox News, like Putin wants to conquer the whole of Europe, and Zelensky repeats it in his speeches. He said that we're holding the line here at Ukraine, but we're also holding it for the whole of Europe, and we're going to force Russia to the negotiation table. And I just hear the exact same talking points on CNN, and I hear the same talking points in the Trump administration, ultimately, when they're having the conversations there through their various actors and cabinet members and so forth, and surrogates. If that's the case, there's no way that you can have a kind of coherent policy, that it's doomed to fail. Every single policy direction that you take will not succeed. If your idea about what's going on and who you're dealing with is completely false and sort of based on circular reasoning and propaganda, and that's kind of where the United States is right now. This is where Washington is right now. It was bad under the Biden administration. It's potentially worse under the Trump administration. And if we talk about the Middle East, it gets even more erroneous, the assumptions and the ideas and things like that. So there's that problem. That's a fundamental problem. But the other thing is, and I don't mean to sound like overly dramatic with history, but for the U.S. not to take a central role, obviously you have to be responsible, well-informed, and able to be competent in negotiations and diplomacy. But there's a big danger by the U.S. receding, because other things can fill the vacuum. Okay, there are other European actors that have actually been playing the role of chief whip in NATO. I'm talking about Britain as an example. Okay, the rhetoric is much more strident. It has been for the whole conflict coming out of London, from Boris Johnson right now to Keir Starmer. And so Britain has a very different agenda, you could say, probably even than the United States. I know they've worked together like a hand in glove for a long time, but they're giving Britain and maybe some other dangerous actors and maybe slightly more ideologically driven, like Poland, in terms of their historical relationship with Russia. And these are the things that you want to avoid, because if the U.S. pulls back, then they will eventually be pulled back in. And history has shown the United States being pulled into two major wars in the last century, twice. And then to marshal the rebuilding of the disaster. And do we want a repeat of that, or can we do things to prevent that from happening? And I don't believe in coincidences. And the START, I think Colonel Wilkerson or Ray mentioned the START Treaty. This attack this week is very significant, because more than anything, it's a war that was declared on the START Treaty. Okay, all of these agreements are lapsed. The ABM, the INF Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty, and now the START Treaty. So this was, I think, a very calculated provocation, and I don't think it came from Kiev. I think this came from a NATO country, possibly Britain, possibly the U.S. elements within the U.S. intelligence were well aware, provided the ISR for these attacks, I'm sure, but some plausible deniability, because the United States may have been, hands off on the actual operation. But think about that. No coincidence there that starts up for review very soon. And they want to have this bundled agreement like with Iran. They want to bundle in this giant all-encompassing agreement. That's not going to happen. So, but we still get these provocations. And you know what? Last week, Britain launched their strategic defense review. And the centerpiece of that, this is no coincidence, was called the Kill Web. It was about drone swarms. And this operation that the Ukrainians mounted with the help of NATO actors was called this Operation Spider's Web. I don't believe in coincidences. I think this was deliberate. This is the future of asymmetric warfare. And as our other panelists said, this can just go on and on and on. And it's hugely dangerous because you have the ability here to threaten governments, to paralyze through constant swarms of these types of attacks, to paralyze governments. And when you're dealing with nuclear powers, at some point, a nuclear power could opt to launch a preemptive strike if they think there's an existential threat in terms of their nuclear deterrence, dealing with nuclear powers. It's a very dangerous area. We cannot proceed down this road. I don't think it's a sane path to gamble. And the talk in London from the MOD and everybody else is, yeah, we need to give Russia a bloody nose. We need to teach them a lesson. Ukraine's going to, get the upper hand now. That's the belief now for the last 3 years. So the U.S. should be moving in to say, we're not doing this. But that's not happening with the Trump administration. That is hugely concerning, plus the rest of Europe. But some world leader, some government needs to step forward and take a leader, because the Trump administration is Donald Trump himself being uninformed about a lot of the nuances of these things and not delegating to, I think, competent subject area experts. I think he's very weak. He's showing himself as being a very weak leader, and is as aloof in many ways as Joe Biden, to take the rhetoric away. And I am hoping for the best, but I'm also being realistic because I'm looking at how this is progressing, and I see it going on a bad arc on all three major flashpoints at the moment. And this needs to be dealt with now, or things could spiral out of control down the road.
Vladimir Putin and Russia have been very firm. This is all about pressuring Russia to capitulate and give up on essentially what it's been demanding for several years plus now, since the very beginning of this thing. And Russia just won't. Putin will not relent, does not capitulate. So what does this all say to you?
Against the background of the wish by both Putin and Trump to have a more decent relationship between the US and Russia. That's the pervasive reality here. They're together on that. They give priority to that. Everything else, in my view, is secondary. And if you buy into my theory, you can understand a lot of the punishment that Putin will not be provoked to react to, and the way Trump keeps supporting Putin, for example, on encouraging the talks in Ukraine. Now, they both have a mutual interest in that, but they also have a mutual interest in allowing each other to back away from Ukraine. Putin has won, as Larry said. Yeah, he's won. But Trump needs some lipstick on the pig of defeat, and Putin, in my view, is flexible enough to give him that. Why? Because he's a nice guy? No, because he doesn't want to take over all of Ukraine, okay? So what about Odessa? What about Kharkov? The notion of Russian forces fighting Ukrainians in Odessa, this beautiful city, and Kharkov is crazy. Putin doesn't want to do that. So there's room for negotiation. Putin said 2.5 years ago at the end of one of these long Q&As that I think only I read the text of, okay? He said, Odessa could be a яблоко раздора. It could be an apple of discord. Think about your mythology, okay? Or it could be a way of getting irreconcilable differences together so we can work really difficult things out. That's what Odessa could be. I think that there's still a prospect. Does Putin want to destroy Ukraine? I don't think so. I think that he'd prefer to have a Ukraine that was viable enough, and it can't be viable enough on its own without access to the sea, and that means Odessa. So there's things to work with here. Now, with respect to the propaganda, to the public thing here, the rhetoric, it's interesting. Biden said several times, do you think Do you think that Putin's going to stop Ukraine, Poland, Baltics? Well, it's going to be really easy for Putin to say, look, Donald, this is what we do. I will promise you that I will not try to take over Ukraine. I'll write it down, nor Poland, nor the Baltics. I'll promise that. And you can advertise that to the American brainwashed public as you got me to agree to that. Now, what the American public doesn't know, and this is key, all right? The Russians stopped. They stopped in March, 6 weeks after the invasion of Ukraine, because they scared the pants off Zelensky, and he picked his best friend to negotiate with them, and they had initial negotiation. Now it's going to be much tougher. But I don't think the Russians want more than what they already have. They have the power to insist on it. It's on the fringes here. And again, against the background of this overweening desire, which I can't really explain very well, but I know it's there, of both sides to create a more decent relationship one with the other, Russia, US détente, or even rapprochement. I think that can be explained to the American people in a gradual way, and that's why as these talks go on and on and on and on, that's a good thing. We can have them go on. The Russians will continue to progress, and their hands will get stronger. And finally, Trump will realize, well, what will Putin give me in terms of this lipstick I need to put on this proverbial pig?
Is we know that the CIA, we know that US intelligence, UK intelligence, so we know that they're actively involved in helping Ukraine with these kind of operations, like what we saw with so-called Operation Spiderweb and all these attacks on Russian territory. Won't eventually, if this goes on and on and on and on, won't eventually this lead to a kind of attack, or could lead to a kind of attack that Russia cannot hold back on, that it will be compelled to respond in a massive way? And I think that's one of the dangers I see of this going on and on and on. Your take?
Well, as Clausewitz points out very clearly, particularly in Book 8, you never know when that moment is going to arrive once you've let slip the dogs of war. You never know. And the deeper you get into it, the greater your ignorance grows. And let me say a point about Odessa. If you've read any Alan Furse, a better historian than most historians, you know that Odessa is a criminal city, basically. Beautiful people, yeah, but mafia-like existence. And I don't think, as Ray said, Putin would want it. I know his naval commanders probably salivate over it, because if they had it, they then would have 3 major ports on the northern rim of the Black Sea, and they would make our venturing into that sea very dicey. So in terms of strategic interest, if I were a sailor, I definitely would want to complete my coup d'etat, if you will, with regard to the Black Sea with Odessa. But I wouldn't want the problems that Odessa would bring, for the very reasons that Alan Furse points out vividly in almost every one of his books in one way or another. So I agree with Ray that I don't think Putin wants the problem of partisans who, from World War II alone, if not earlier, are some of the worst in the world in terms of killing everything, men, women, children, taking your gold teeth and so forth. That's what he would get if he tried to invest all of Ukraine, not to mention others that might participate from across the border, as it were. So I agree that he doesn't want the whole thing, but he may be compelled to take more than even he wants, because he can't just, I don't think, stop and let himself be piecemealed to death with things like just happened and other things that might happen right near the front that is thus created. So he's got a problem there. The inexorable movement of his forces is something that generals would tell him, we don't want to stop and just defend. We don't want to stop and just vegetate. So this conflict has its own dynamics on the ground that play into the strategic aspects of it. And that's one of the things we're trying to exploit. We're trying to use that very pressure that Putin's under to either do something, stop, defend, whatever. We're trying to use that to further harass him and to further denigrate his forces. That's not a good recipe for the future of that region. And as I pointed out in other venues, if I were the Poles, not the current government, but if I were the Poles, some of whom I know quite well, I would be wondering whether or not I might be able, a year down the road here, and we're still doing this, work out a deal maybe with Moscow, where I would get some of the territory that I covet, and some Poles do intensely still covet it, and maybe give a backdrop to the problem that Putin is now confronted with, and give a sort of a margin of safety for him between real NATO, if it even is still in existence, and I don't think it will be, and his own forces. So there are all kinds of dynamics to this conflict that could play themselves out militarily and otherwise. But I do think the problem we've got right now is, as Patrick said, we don't have any competent people in the United States of America to deal with this problem. And I think it's essential that we do deal with it. It's just the nature of the beast, if you will, that we have to deal with it. And we are not going to do it very competently, and that could deepen the problems.
Yeah, just to round off my thoughts on this particular situation, Danny, it's those in Washington, whether that's J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio or whoever is, pulling together foreign policy, they absolutely have to include Russia in the, some kind of a coherent, binding European security framework. It has to include Russia. The Europeans and the UK are basically saying Russia's persona non grata for all things Europe. NATO will decide, and so forth. And so the U.S. is in a position to make sure that that goes in the right direction. But they need to also understand how this mechanism works. And, for the longest time, NATO has been the glove in which the U.S. could insert its hand to steer military, political, and economic affairs in Europe. And now we're seeing, with the rise of different types of politics coming, including in the U.S., and different types of thinking in terms of foreign policy management of post-World War II zones like Europe and Japan, for instance, the Pacific, a different type of thinking. But this is also a very dangerous interregnum historically. And at the same time, and if you noticed, those who were paying attention, European collective defense was taking shape before the Ukrainian conflict kind of broke out in a big way in February of 2022. And they had just signed the PESCO agreement. So why was that important? It's not exactly problem-free with Europe, because the problem with Europe is they can never get on the same page foreign policy-wise, because you have a collection of all these different countries. NATO provided this continuity, led by the United States, with Britain as number 2, to decide what foreign policy was going to be for Europe. But you can see it eroding now. And I don't think they could get on the same page easily without NATO. So a lot of people in Europe still clinging to NATO. They need the clout of NATO. They need the gravitas of NATO. They need to have this this track outside of their own democratic systems to exert power or to do whatever this new power configuration is going to look like. Because if it's done through Europe, it's going to be completely impossible, and they might just end up subjugating to Asian economic growth and interests, and the fact that the money is in Asia right now. So they're fighting the inevitable in Europe. The United States has to either decide what role they're going to play in this transition into you could call it a multipolar world or a BRICS-centric political economy globally. And I don't see that kind of clarity. I don't really see any vision or strategy coming out of the U.S. other than, rent-seeking opportunities for the Trump and transactional rent-seeking power plays, like, oh, what are you going to give us? What are you going to provide us? And these trade wars that Trump has declared against the world, it's completely directionless. I don't see any clear policy in anywhere in any of this, as well as U.S. foreign policy, other than, like Ray said, Trump's instincts, wanting to do the right thing and stop the wars. Okay, that's a good starting point. but there's a whole lot of other essential things that need to happen to get to that point. And this is the real problem. So I really think there's a lack of imagination in Washington of where America's place in the world is in this transition. And it's still calling China our enemy. What has China ever done to the United States? Potentially they're our enemy. They're going to thwart us from our catbird seat in the global hegemonic position. Ridiculous thinking. But Marco Rubio himself has been parroting this type of rhetoric for years. So is this what these people really think? Because I don't think this is going to work going forward for the United States.
Patrick, they're ad hocing it, as we used to say. You ad hoc things, you ad hoc them. You don't have any real vision or policy. However, on Ukraine, there is this backdrop that I've described 2 times now. And the fly in the ointment is the media. It's the military industrial intelligence media complex, okay? What about the media they're controlled by the rest of the military industrial complex, for God's sake? Look at the multinationals that control the media. Are we chipping away on it? Yes, we are. I think there have been some salutary developments of actually sensible reporting, even in the Financial Times, if you look over the last month. Maybe that's a harbinger of things to come. The real problem is in Germany, where the media is even worse than it is in the United States, if you can believe it. Not quite as bad as Britain, maybe. But German people have been deprived of information that is valid. There's one member of Sarah Wagenknecht's party. Her name is Seven Dagleden. She put it this way: Unsere erste Pflicht ist, sich von diesem Königreich der Lügen nicht dumm machen zu lassen. Okay, so it's our first duty by this Königreich, by this kingdom of Lügen, of lies, okay, nicht dumm machen zu lassen. Okay, don't let ourselves be made dumb. Now, there are a lot of Germans that realize they've been made dumb, okay? And I see that Merz is probably, ironically, a good catalyst for making them wake up and say, my God, our grandfathers told us about what happened in the 30s. Is this the 30s again? And are we ready to deal with the Russians? My God. So what I see here is a gradual chipping away at things where the media might be formed by more reality. I see Danny, your show, and others as making a huge contribution to this, and Americans being able to be informed. But that seems to be the fly in the ointment that I see that's preventing sensible things from happening. It's not only disarray and incompetence and stupidity in Washington, it's the media, which actually has control of a lot of what Washington policies are. Lastly, there's no one that knows this better than Vladimir Putin, who said expressly, this is a virtual quote, 3 years ago, I realize that American foreign policy is made primarily on domestic political considerations. That's how it's formed. So if the media is telling Americans that Putin has 2 horns and he's worse than Hitler, and that has to stop, I see little chips in that. And I applaud you, Danny, and others who are trying to make it possible for Americans to be educated and nicht dumm machen zu lassen.